I am David, 28 years old. Just a few months ago, on the night I celebrated my biggest career milestone and my ultimate promotion, my own mother looked me dead in the eye in front of my boss, my mentors, and my closest colleagues, and calmly stated that she wished I was never born. While I was footing the bill for a lavish five-star dinner, desperately trying to finally win their love after a lifetime of grueling financial and emotional sacrifice, they laughed in my face. They completely humiliated me in front of 12 people I respected deeply, treating my existence like a regrettable mistake, a burden they were forced to endure. But there is one thing they did not know. They did not know that my new corporate promotion meant I was the very person holding the legal rights to their massive, hidden debt. They had absolutely no idea that the quiet, obedient son they had been bleeding dry for years was about to become their worst nightmare. And now, they are the ones crying outside my office, begging for mercy while facing total ruin. Before I tell you exactly how I turned the tables, exposed their lies, and took everything from them, hit that like button if you believe in absolute justice. And let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Your support means the world to me. Now, let's go back to the exact moment my entire world shattered and reformed into something entirely new. The restaurant was Delmonico, the kind of establishment in downtown Seattle where the lighting is always a soft, forgiving gold. The crystal stemware costs more than my first car, and the waiters move like silent ghosts. I had booked their exclusive private dining room 3 months in advance. I paid the exorbitant deposit with the first bonus from my new salary. The crisp white linens, the heavy silver cutlery, the quiet hum of polite conversation drifting from the main floor, the meticulously arranged centerpieces of white orchids. Everything was supposed to be perfect. I wanted it to be perfect. I had invited my top colleagues, my mentors from my days at Stanford, and the people who actually saw my worth every single day in the trenches of corporate consulting. And, in a final, desperate, and ultimately foolish attempt to build a bridge that had been burning since my childhood, I invited my parents. I sat near the head of the long mahogany table. My mother, Eleanor, sat diagonally across from me. She was wearing a tailored navy dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, paid for by a backup credit card I was quietly paying off every month. My father, Robert, sat next to her, nursing a glass of 20-year-old scotch that cost more than a week of my college grocery budget. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. I could feel the tension radiating from my parents from the moment they walked through the heavy oak doors empty-handed. Not a single card, not a single flower, not even a cheap drugstore congratulations balloon. Just an aura of profound inconvenience. The conversation around the table had been a monumental struggle. My colleagues, bless their hearts, tried their absolute best to include my parents and make them feel welcome. My friend Marcus, a guy who usually could make a brick wall laugh, asked my father about his golf game and his recent retirement plans. Sarah, a brilliant woman I met during my MBA program who was now a powerhouse analyst, tried to compliment my mother on her pearl necklace. But every single time the spotlight shifted to me, every time someone tried to praise the grueling 90-hour weeks I had put into my latest project, my parents expertly and ruthlessly redirected the conversation. They steered it right back to the only subject they ever cared about: my younger brother, Arthur. I was forcing a smile, feeling the familiar knot tighten in my stomach, the one I had carried since I was a little boy. I was just hoping we could get through dessert without a major incident when the final blow landed. Someone, I think it was one of the senior partners, had just asked me about the upcoming real estate restructuring deal I was managing. I took a breath to answer, to explain the complexities of the lawsuit we had just avoided for a major client. But my mother placed her heavy silver fork down on her china plate. The soft clink echoed loudly in the private room, silencing the low murmur of voices. She looked around the table, her eyes sweeping over my colleagues with a look of polite boredom, and then she fixed her cold, unwavering gaze on me. She did not whisper. She did not lean in. She did not try to keep it a private family matter. Her voice was crystal clear, carrying perfectly over the soft jazz playing from the ceiling speakers. You know, sometimes I wonder why David takes these little office jobs so seriously, she said. Her voice was coated in that sweet, venomous tone she had perfected over the years, the tone that sounded like honey but cut like glass. Arthur never causes this kind of drama with his ambitions. He is building an empire. Honestly, looking at how exhausting you make everything, David. She paused, taking a delicate sip of her expensive white wine, letting the suspense build. I wish you were never born. Conversations snapped shut instantly. Glasses stopped midair. The jazz music suddenly felt entirely too loud, mocking the absolute devastation that had just been dropped into the center of the room. I felt the blood drain completely from my face. The edges of my vision blurred. I looked at Sarah. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly parted in pure, unadulterated shock. Marcus gripped his linen napkin so hard his knuckles turned bone white. His jaw clenched tight. My boss, Mr. Sterling, a man who commanded boardrooms with a single glance and rarely showed emotion, froze completely. He was staring at my mother as if she had just grown a second head, utterly bewildered by the sheer cruelty of her statement. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, heavy and loaded. Every pair of eyes at that table swung toward me. They were waiting to see what I would do. They knew me as the quiet professional, the guy who absorbed pressure, the guy who always found a diplomatic solution to the worst crisis, the man who never let his emotions dictate his actions. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to offer a nervous, self-deprecating laugh, to make a pathetic excuse for her, to swallow the poison just like I always did to keep the peace. I looked at my mother. Her expression was triumphant. She was waiting for me to break. She thrived on it. I looked at my father. He was casually swirling his scotch, watching the amber liquid catch the light. Not a single trace of defense or protection for his eldest son on his face. He actually looked mildly amused by the whole spectacle. In that frozen fraction of a second, something deep inside my chest died. The desperate, hopeful little boy who just wanted his parents to be proud of him, the boy who had broken his back for their approval, simply ceased to exist. I felt a strange, icy calm wash over my entire body. I did not realize it right then, but that was the moment my life truly began. I took a deep breath, letting the absolute reality of my family settle into my bones. To understand why I reacted the way I did, and how I eventually orchestrated their complete and utter downfall, you have to understand the nightmare I survived to get to that chair. Growing up in our two-story, colonial-style house in Rochester was like living in a theater where I was permanently cast as the stagehand, and my brother Arthur was the undisputed star of the show. The house itself was beautiful on the outside, exactly the kind of home you see in commercials selling the perfect American dream. We had a manicured green lawn, a fresh coat of white paint on the siding, a solid neighborhood where people attended HOA meetings and hosted neighborhood barbecues. But inside those walls, the air felt like it was constantly closing in on me. The unspoken, ironclad rule of our household was simple. Arthur was the sun, and the rest of us were just insignificant planets meant to orbit him and keep him warm. If Arthur sneezed, my mother treated it like a national emergency, rushing to make homemade soup and fluffing his pillows. If Arthur brought home a participation ribbon from a junior varsity track meet, a race he finished second to last in, my father would announce it at the dinner table like breaking news on primetime television. Arthur was handsome, charismatic, incredibly manipulative, and entirely allergic to hard work. But in my parents' eyes, he was the golden child. He could do absolutely no wrong. Then there was me. I was the reliable one, the quiet one, the invisible one. I was the one who fixed the broken sink when the plumber was too expensive, the one who shoveled the snow from the driveway in freezing temperatures while Arthur slept in, the one who got straight A's without anyone ever bothering to check my report cards. I learned very early on that my achievements were not a source of pride for my parents. They were threats to Arthur's fragile ego. I remember the spring I turned 14. It was a crisp April afternoon. I had just won first place at the state regional math competition. I rode the yellow school bus home clutching that crisp, embossed certificate in a heavy plastic folder. I was terrified of bending the corners. I walked through the front door, my heart hammering against my ribs with that foolish, childlike hope that maybe, just this once, they would look at me with the same beaming pride they reserved for my brother. I found my mother in the kitchen, casually flipping through a glossy lifestyle magazine. I walked up to the marble counter and laid the certificate down right in front of her, right on top of an article about summer vacation homes. "Mom, I won," I said, my voice shaking a little with excitement. "First place in the whole state. My teacher said I might get a scholarship." She did not even look up from her magazine. She reached out, blindly pushed the certificate an inch to the left so it would not block her view of a recipe, and gave a dismissive, irritated wave of her hand. "That is nice, David," she murmured, her tone perfectly flat. Then, a split second later, her face lit up, transforming completely, and she finally looked at me. "Did you see Arthur riding his new dirt bike outside? He is getting so fast. His balance is just incredible for his age. Go outside and make sure he does not fall and scrape his knee." I stood there for a moment, absorbing the sting. Then, I quietly took my certificate, walked up the stairs to my small bedroom, and slid it into the back of my closet under a pile of old shoeboxes. I never showed them another grade, another award, or another piece of my life again. As the years went by, the emotional neglect systematically morphed into blatant financial exploitation. By the time I hit high school, my parents sat me down in the living room and explained that since I was the older brother, I needed to learn adult responsibility. They completely stopped giving me an allowance, refused to buy my school clothes, and told me I had to cover my own expenses. I did not argue. I got a job at a local diner on the edge of town, flipping greasy burgers and scrubbing dirty floors until my hands smelled permanently of cheap oil and bleach. I woke up at 4 in the morning to work the breakfast shift before the school bell rang, and I worked late nights wiping down tables while Arthur went to high school parties in clothes my parents bought for him. When it was time for college, my parents made it abundantly clear there was no college fund for me. They sat me down and said their savings were tied up in their 401k and the heavy house mortgage, and they couldn't afford to help. I was forced to take out student loans that felt like a mountain of lead bricks on my chest. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously during my undergrad years just to keep my head above water. I tutored struggling freshmen in statistics. I worked the grueling overnight inventory shift at a massive warehouse hauling boxes until my back ached, and I drove for a rideshare company on the weekends, dealing with drunk and belligerent passengers. Meanwhile, Arthur's college experience was fully funded. A full ride on the bank of Mom and Dad. My parents paid his out-of-state tuition, the rent for his luxury off-campus apartment, and his ridiculous fraternity dues. When I asked my father why the rules were completely different for Arthur, he looked at me like I was a fool who didn't understand the real world. "Arthur is building a network," my father said, aggressively adjusting his silk tie. "He needs to socialize with the right people to secure his future. You are just a bookworm, David. You do not need the same resources or connections to sit at a desk." Even while juggling 3 jobs and surviving on 4 hours of sleep a night, I somehow managed to send a little money home. My mother called me crying hysterically during the winter of my junior year, claiming my Aunt Susan was terribly sick and they were struggling to help with her mounting medical bills while keeping up with the house mortgage. She sobbed, saying they were drowning in debt and might lose the house. Panicked. Despite everything, they were my family. I tightened my own belt even further, lived on cheap instant ramen, wore shoes with holes in the soles, and set up an automatic bank transfer of $2,000 every single month to their joint account. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was stepping up and being a good son. Then came the freezing November day I discovered the absolute, ugly truth. I had driven 6 hours through a snowstorm back to Rochester for Thanksgiving dinner. The house smelled like roasted turkey and thick, unspoken tension. I needed a pen to fill out a financial aid form for my student loan provider, so I walked into my father's home office and opened the top drawer of his mahogany desk. I moved a stack of utility envelopes, and underneath, I found a bank statement from the exact joint account I had been sending my hard-earned money to. I froze. My eyes locked onto the numbers. I scanned the lines of transactions. The $2,000 I transferred on the first of every month was not going to a mortgage company. It was not going to a hospital for Aunt Susan. It was being routed directly to a luxury auto dealership in a neighboring city. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs as I dug deeper into the disorganized drawer. My hands were shaking. I found the lease agreement tucked inside a red folder. It was for a brand new, fully loaded Porsche 911. The primary driver listed was not my father. It was Arthur. I felt physically sick. The room spun. My vision blurred as pure, unadulterated rage flooded my system. All those freezing nights I stayed up until 4 in the morning, shivering in a drafty apartment because I could not afford to turn on the heat. All those times I skipped meals and ignored my growling stomach so my mother would not cry about losing our childhood home. It was all a massive, calculated lie. I was breaking my back, destroying my youth, to fund a luxury sports car so my lazy, entitled brother could play the role of a successful entrepreneur to impress his frat brothers. I marched into the living room, gripping the lease agreement so hard the paper crumpled. My father was sitting in his leather recliner, casually watching a football game. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a rage I had never felt before. I threw the papers directly onto his lap. He barely flinched. He casually picked up the paper, glanced at the Porsche logo, and then looked at me with cold, hard, unfeeling eyes. "It is exactly what it looks like," he said calmly, not an ounce of guilt in his voice. "You lied to me." I shot back, my voice rising. "Mom cried on the phone about Aunt Susan. You said you were losing the house. I have been sending you $2,000 a month. Money I bleed for. And you bought Arthur a Porsche?" My father stood up, towering over me. He pointed a thick finger directly at my chest. "Do not raise your voice in my house. Arthur is trying to get a tech startup off the ground. He needs a certain image to attract high-level investors. You work in a cubicle, David. You would not understand the intense demands of high-level business. We used family resources to support the family's best interests." End of discussion. Family resources? I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that scraped my throat. "That is my blood and sweat. That is my money. You stole from me. You owe us for raising you," my mother yelled, rushing into the room with a dish towel in her hands, her face twisted in anger. "Stop being so selfish, David. Your brother is going to be a millionaire soon, and then he will pay you back. You should be honored to help him build his future instead of being so jealous and petty." I looked at the two of them, standing shoulder to shoulder, vigorously defending the indefensible. They felt absolutely no shame. They felt entirely entitled to my life force. I realized then, with crystal clarity, that I was not a son to them. I was an ATM. I was a workhorse. I turned around and walked out of the house that Thanksgiving without eating a single bite of food. I drove 6 hours back to my freezing apartment in complete silence. But I did not stop the transfers. Not yet. I was close to finishing my degree, and I was secretly applying to the highly competitive MBA program at Stanford. I knew if I cut them off then, the relentless harassment, the screaming phone calls, and the aggressive guilt trips would destroy my focus and jeopardize my exams. I needed to get out cleanly. I swallowed the rage, shoved it deep down into a dark, locked box inside my mind, and let them think they had one. I let them think I was still their obedient fool. 2 relentless years later, I walked across the sunlit stage at Stanford, holding an MBA that represented more sleepless nights, skipped meals, and quiet suffering than anyone in the audience could ever measure. I had survived. I had beaten the odds stacked against me by my own blood. I landed a highly coveted job at a premier corporate consulting firm in Seattle. The starting salary was beyond anything I had ever imagined, and the signing bonus alone was enough to wipe out a massive chunk of my suffocating student loans. For the first time in my entire life, I felt like I was breathing clean air. Seattle was a world away from Rochester. The persistent rain, the towering glass skyscrapers, the constant, energizing hum of ambition in the streets. It felt like a genuine fresh start. At the firm, My relentless work ethic, forged in diners and warehouses, finally paid off. People noticed. I did not have to shout to be heard or beg for basic respect. My immaculate spreadsheets, my razor-sharp market analysis, my late-night crisis management, it all spoke for itself. My boss, Mr. Sterling, was a man who did not tolerate fools or office politics. He was demanding, brilliant, deeply fair, and a legend in the corporate world. He pulled me into his spacious corner office after my first major project wrapped up 3 weeks ahead of schedule and millions under budget. "You have a rare gear, David," Sterling told me, leaning back in his heavy leather chair and steepling his fingers. "You do not just solve problems. You anticipate them before they happen. You operate with a level of resilience I rarely see in guys your age. Keep this up, keep your head clear, and you are going to be running this floor in a few years." I walked out of his office feeling a strange, unfamiliar tightness in my chest. It was the feeling of being genuinely valued for who I was and what I could do. It was completely foreign to me, and I desperately wanted to hold on to it. But peace was never a permanent state when it came to my family. The gravitational pull of their toxicity was incredibly strong, and they always found a way to reach their claws across the country. Aunt Susan called me one Sunday morning. I was sitting in my apartment, drinking coffee and reviewing a contract. I should have known better than to answer. Susan played the role of the sweet, caring, eccentric aunt, but she was entirely loyal to my mother. She was the family spy, the information gatherer. "David, sweetie, I saw your new job title on LinkedIn." Aunt Susan purred through the phone, her voice dripping with fake affection. "Senior consultant. That sounds so incredibly fancy. Your mother must be so proud of her boy." "I have not talked to her much, Aunt Susan. I've been busy," I replied, keeping my guard up, my tone neutral. "Oh, you know how she is. She loves you deeply. She just has a hard time showing it." Susan lied smoothly, practicing the family tradition of gaslighting. "You should invite them out to Seattle. Show them your new life. Maybe a nice dinner? It would mean the absolute world to them to see you doing well. And strictly between you and me, Arthur has been struggling. The tech startup isn't going well. Your parents are incredibly stressed about money. They need a win, David. They need to see family." I hung up the phone feeling a familiar, sickening guilt settling in my stomach. Despite the Porsche, despite the years of neglect, the trauma bond was a heavy, rusted chain. The little boy inside me, the one who just wanted to show them his math certificate, still wanted to prove them wrong. I wanted to sit across from them at a nice restaurant, pay the expensive bill with my own premium credit card, and force them to acknowledge that I was a massive success. I wanted them to see that the son they treated like dirt had built an empire from scratch without a single dime of their money. So, against all logic and my better judgment, I organized the celebration dinner at Delmonico. I booked the expensive private room. I paid for their first-class flights to Seattle. I even arranged for a black town car to pick them up from the airport and take them to a luxury hotel I paid for. The week leading up to the dinner was chaotic and brutal at the firm. A senior consultant named Greg, a guy who got his job through aggressive nepotism and spent most of his day playing golf on his phone or sucking up to management, actively tried to sabotage my quarterly report. He intentionally withheld crucial financial data from a major client profile, hoping I would bomb the presentation so he could swoop in, play the hero, and take over the lucrative account. But he severely underestimated me. I had spent my entire life dealing with master manipulators. I bypassed him completely, pulled the data directly from the client's legal team, worked 48 hours straight, and delivered a flawless, bulletproof presentation that secured a massive contract renewal. Marcus, my closest friend at the firm and a guy who took zero disrespect, cornered Greg in the break room later that afternoon. I was pouring coffee and heard the whole thing. I could hear Marcus's voice dripping with absolute, lethal disdain. "You try to mess with David again, Greg, and I will personally ensure Sterling sees your internet browsing history and your fake expense reports for the last 6 months. Back off. You are out of your league." Knowing I had fierce, loyal people like Marcus in my corner made the impending arrival of my parents slightly more bearable. I told myself I was strong enough to handle them now. I was an adult. I was successful. The night of the dinner finally arrived. I stood by the entrance of the private room, greeting my colleagues as they filtered in. Everyone was dressed sharply. There was laughter, warmth, and genuine celebration in the air. The waiters poured expensive champagne. And then my parents walked in. They did not look around with awe at the beautiful venue I had provided. They did not smile warmly at me. My mother immediately wrinkled her nose at the expensive floral arrangement in the center of the table, muttering something about allergies. My father looked at his watch, sighed heavily, and adjusted his suit jacket, looking profoundly bored. Traffic from the hotel was an absolute nightmare. My father grumbled loudly as his only greeting. Not a hello. Not a "we are proud of you." Just a complaint. I swallowed hard, pasting on a diplomatic smile. Glad you made it safely. Let me introduce you to everyone. I walked them around the room. I introduced them to Sarah, to Marcus, and finally to Mr. Sterling. Sterling extended his hand with a polite, professional smile. Robert, Eleanor, it is a pleasure to meet you, Sterling said, shaking my father's hand. You must be incredibly proud of David. He is one of the sharpest minds we have ever brought on board. He's a true asset. My mother offered a thin, brittle smile, her eyes darting around the room as if assessing the net worth of everyone present. Oh, well, David always liked reading his little books. We are just glad he finally found a desk to sit at so he doesn't get into trouble. Our youngest, Arthur, he is the real visionary of the family. He is building a massive tech company from the ground up. You know how it is, the true innovators do not work for other people. They create the jobs. She actually said that, to the CEO of the firm. Sterling's smile did not falter, but his eyes turned completely icy, assessing her instantly. Is that so? He replied, his tone perfectly neutral but laced with an undeniable edge. He looked over at me, a silent message of solidarity and understanding passing between us. He saw right through them. We sat down for dinner. The food arrived in immaculate courses: lobster bisque, Wagyu beef, seared scallops, and truffles. I paid for all of it. Yet, as the plates were cleared, my parents launched a relentless, calculated campaign of passive-aggressive destruction. When Marcus enthusiastically mentioned my recent promotion and the massive bonus attached to it, my father laughed mockingly. Promotions in these corporate gigs just mean more paperwork and higher blood pressure. My father sneered, cutting his steak. Arthur makes his own schedule. He is his own boss. He just closed a massive meeting in Miami last week. Fringed benefits of being a CEO. Arthur had driven the Porsche I paid for to Miami to party with college girls. There was no meeting. I knew it. They knew it. But they sat there, lying through their teeth to my respected colleagues, desperately trying to make me look small and insignificant. The anger was building inside me, a hot, heavy pressure behind my ribs, threatening to explode. I kept my mouth shut. I focused on my breathing. I just wanted the night to end. I thought the worst was over. I was so incredibly wrong. Dessert was finally served. Small, elegant plates of dark chocolate ganache topped with edible gold leaf were placed delicately in front of each guest. The room had settled into a strained, uncomfortable quiet. My colleagues were smart, highly perceptive people. They had picked up on the toxic, abusive dynamic very quickly. The easy, flowing laughter from the beginning of the night had completely vanished, replaced by a careful, defensive, polite chatter that felt agonizingly forced. Mr. Sterling, sensing the desperate need to salvage the celebration and formally recognize my hard work, stood up. He picked up his crystal champagne glass and tapped it gently with a heavy silver spoon. The clear, ringing sound instantly commanded the room's attention. Everyone turned to him. If I may have your attention for a moment, Sterling began, his deep voice carrying a natural, undeniable authority. I want to propose a toast. When I look at our industry, I see a lot of people who desperately want the prestigious title, but absolutely do not want to put in the grueling work. And then, there is David. Sterling turned his body to look directly at me. His expression was serious and full of genuine respect. David stepped into this firm and took over a portfolio that would have broken seasoned veterans. He navigated a potential disastrous lawsuit with our biggest client last month not by shouting, not by throwing money at the problem, but by finding a brilliant, quiet legal loophole that saved everyone millions of dollars. He is a man of immense character and integrity. He does not ask for the spotlight, but he undeniably deserves it. To David, a brilliant consultant, an invaluable asset to this firm, and an even better man. To David, the table echoed in unison. Marcus raised his glass high, a huge grin on his face. Sarah beamed at me, her eyes shining with pride. For a fleeting, wonderful second, the warmth and validation I had been craving my entire life washed over me. I felt seen. I felt respected. And then my mother decided she had had enough of my success. She could not stomach it. She did not stand up. She did not raise a glass. She just let the celebratory silence settle for exactly one beat too long before she spoke, her voice laced with pure venom. "Well, that is quite a dramatic speech," my mother said. Her voice cut through the warmth in the room like a rusty razor blade. "It is nice to see David found a place where he fits in, doing paperwork. You know, sometimes I wonder why David takes these little office jobs so incredibly seriously." The entire room stiffened. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. My father chuckled. He actually chuckled, swirling his scotch, looking entirely pleased with her cruelty. My mother continued, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute, calculated malice. "Arthur never causes this kind of drama with his ambitions. He is out there making real waves, dealing with real money. Honestly, looking at how exhausting and pathetic you make everything, David." She leaned back in her plush chair, crossing her arms, a look of pure, unadulterated disgust resting on her face. "I wish you were never born." The loop was closed. The words hung in the air, heavy, toxic, and suffocating. I looked around the table. Sarah's hand was covering her mouth, horror plastered on her face. Marcus looked like he was about to jump across the mahogany table and physically remove my father from the room. Sterling was staring at my parents with a look of cold, clinical calculation, the exact kind of look a judge gives a convicted, unrepentant criminal right before sentencing. The immense pressure inside me finally snapped. But it was not a loud, messy explosion. It was not a screaming match. It was the quiet, absolute, permanent shattering of the last rusted chain that held me to them. The lifelong illusion of family evaporated into thin air, leaving nothing but cold reality. The paralyzing fear of their disapproval vanished completely. I did not feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a man who had finally woken up from a very long, very bad nightmare. I placed my white linen napkin neatly on the table. The movement was slow, deliberate. Every single eye in the room tracked my hand. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I stood up to my full height. I was taller than my father. I was stronger than my father. And for the first time in my 28 years on Earth, I knew deep in my soul that I was better than both of them. I looked down at my mother. The smug, victorious satisfaction on her face began to falter slightly, replaced by a tiny, uncertain flicker of confusion. She fully expected me to cry. She expected me to leave the room in shame, so she could play the long-suffering victim and tell everyone how overly sensitive and dramatic I was. "You wish I was never born," I repeated. My voice was incredibly steady, perfectly calm, and terrifyingly cold. It echoed in the dead quiet room. My father bristled, puffing his chest out, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Now listen here, David. Do not make a scene in front of your little friends." "Shut up," I said. I did not yell. I just commanded him with absolute authority. And to my absolute shock, and perhaps his own, he snapped his mouth shut. I looked back at my mother, burning her face into my memory for the very last time. "You have spent my entire life treating me like a bank, an unpaid servant, and a punching bag. You stole my money to buy your favorite son a Porsche while I ate ramen to survive. You lied to me about family medical emergencies to bleed my bank account dry. You took everything I had to give and gave me nothing but contempt in return. How dare you? My mother hissed, her face turning a blotchy, ugly red. She glanced nervously at Sterling, suddenly realizing her carefully crafted mask had completely slipped in front of very important, very powerful people. No, I cut her off, stepping closer to the table, my voice ringing with finality. How dare you? But you know what? You finally gave me exactly what I needed tonight. You gave me clarity. Perfect clarity. I looked at both of them, memorizing the genuine panic that was finally starting to set in behind their eyes as they realized I was not backing down. You wish I was never born, I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the absolute, crushing weight of a final judgment. Consider your wish granted. Consider me as if I never existed. Live your lives as though there was never a son named David. My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked terrified. I am completely done with you, I said. I turned to Mr. Sterling. I sincerely apologize for the disruption, sir. Please enjoy the rest of the evening. The bill is fully taken care of. I did not wait for an answer. I turned on my heel and walked out of the private room. I walked straight through the main dining area, pushed through the heavy glass doors of Delmonico, and stepped out into the freezing, torrential Seattle rain. I did not look back once. I hailed a cab, climbed into the back seat, and pulled out my phone. As the city lights blurred outside the wet window, I opened my banking app. I went straight to the scheduled automatic transfers. The monthly $2,000 payment for Arthur's precious Porsche. Cancel. The payment I still made toward their exorbitant utility bills. Cancel. The backup credit card I let them keep for emergencies, which they routinely used for fancy restaurants. Deactivate. I watched the screen load. I watched the green confirmation checkmarks appear one by one. It took less than 40 seconds to permanently sever the financial arteries I had been bleeding into for almost a decade. By the time I reached my apartment, my phone was aggressively blowing up. 13 missed calls from my father. 7 text messages from my mother calling me ungrateful, dramatic, and demanding I turn the credit cards back on immediately or they would call the police. I tossed the phone onto my couch, ignoring it. I walked over to the window, looking out over the glittering Seattle skyline. The storm was just beginning. The financial ruin they were about to face without my money was going to be catastrophic. But what they did not know, what they could not possibly comprehend, was that cutting off their monthly allowance was only the beginning. The real storm, the legal avalanche I was about to bury them under, was still coming. And when it finally hit, there would be nowhere left for them to hide. The days immediately following that disastrous, life-altering dinner at Delmonico were a strange, surreal blur of absolute, ringing silence and relentless, punishing work. For the very first time in my entire adult life, my smartphone was not aggressively vibrating every few hours with unreasonable demands, petty complaints, or entirely fabricated financial emergencies from my parents in Rochester. Cutting off those credit cards and deliberately canceling those automatic bank transfers had finally achieved the one thing that years of logical pleading and desperate begging could never do: completely shut them up. But I knew my family dynamic better than I knew my own reflection in the mirror. I knew with absolute certainty that this heavy silence was not a sign of acceptance or reflection on their part. It was a highly calculated tactical retreat. They were simply regrouping in the dark, gathering their twisted forces, and desperately trying to figure out exactly how to crack the vault of my bank account back open. They were waiting for me to feel guilty. They were waiting for the lifelong programming of obedience to kick in and force me to apologize for their atrocious behavior. Marcus, my closest colleague and the only person who truly understood the depth of the betrayal that night, practically moved into my downtown apartment that first incredibly difficult weekend. He did not treat me like a fragile victim, which I deeply appreciated. He brought greasy takeout containers from a local Thai place, a stack of heavily redacted corporate files, and a bottle of ridiculously expensive whiskey he casually claimed he just had lying around his kitchen. He did not push me to talk about my mother's horrific comment. He did not ask me how I was feeling. He just sat there on my couch, quietly reviewing complex client files on his laptop while I stood in the dark, staring blankly at the relentless Seattle rain hitting the thick glass of my living room window. When I finally turned around and told him exactly what I had done with the bank accounts and the credit lines, Marcus stopped typing. He closed his laptop with a soft click, poured me another generous glass of the amber whiskey, and looked me dead in the eye. "It is about damn time you saved yourself, David," Marcus said, his voice entirely devoid of pity and full of fierce loyalty. "You have carried their dead weight for a decade. Let them drown in their own financial mess. You owe them absolutely nothing." I took his advice to heart and threw myself entirely into my demanding work at the corporate consulting firm. The massive commercial real estate restructuring deal I was currently managing required my absolute, undivided focus. We were dealing with a major corporate client who was facing a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar lawsuit over a series of defaulted commercial properties. Mr. Sterling, our brilliant and intimidating CEO, had personally trusted me to navigate this incredibly dangerous legal minefield. I practically lived at the office, sleeping on a small leather couch in the break room more often than I slept in my own bed. The grueling 90-hour work weeks were an absolute blessing in disguise. The relentless pressure of the lawsuit kept my mind razor-sharp and firmly anchored in the present, keeping my thoughts far away from the toxic, suffocating gravity of my parents and the brother who was currently driving around in a Porsche funded by my misery. But the hard-won peace was abruptly interrupted about 3 weeks later by a phone call from an unknown New York number. I answered it without thinking, assuming it was opposing counsel for the real estate deal. Instead, it was Jason. Jason was a guy I grew up with back in my hometown of Rochester. We played Little League baseball together, navigated the awkward halls of middle school together, and though we had naturally drifted apart during my intense college years, I had always considered him a relatively decent friend. I had even spent hours helping him completely rewrite his resume a few years back to help him land a decent corporate job in software sales. "David, man, it has been absolutely forever," Jason said, his voice booming through the phone speaker with a loud, artificial cheerfulness that immediately put my nerves on edge. "I just saw the update about your massive promotion on LinkedIn. Senior consultant in a Seattle high-rise. That is absolutely huge, man. What kind of salary are they throwing at you for a fancy title like that? You must be swimming in it." I frowned deeply, leaning back in my ergonomic office chair and rubbing my tired eyes. The question was incredibly forward, intrusive, and completely out of character for a guy I had not spoken to in 3 years. "The salary pays the bills, Jason," I replied smoothly, keeping my tone perfectly neutral and professional. "How have you been?" "Oh, you know me, just grinding away in the sales trenches," Jason laughed, though the sound was incredibly forced and hollow. "Actually, I am going to be flying into Seattle next week for a big tech conference. I would absolutely love to grab a beer, catch up on old times, see where the big shot actually works. What is the exact address of your firm anyway? Maybe I can swing by your office and take you out to lunch." Something deep in my gut twisted violently. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. The timing of this sudden friendly outreach was entirely too perfect to be a coincidence. My family had just been completely cut off financially. Their primary source of stolen income was entirely gone, and suddenly my old hometown friend was desperately, aggressively trying to find out my exact 6-figure salary and the physical location of my office building. "I am completely booked solid next week, Jason," I said, my voice hardening. "I have a major client audit that requires my attention around the clock." "Oh, come on, man. You cannot even spare 20 minutes for a quick lunch with an old friend?" Jason pressed, his tone shifting from overly friendly to slightly manipulative. "Actually, your mom mentioned you were working way too hard these days. She said you guys had a little falling out at a dinner, but, family is family, right? You should really pick up the phone and call her, David. She is incredibly worried about your mental health. She thinks the stress of the city is getting to you." There it was, the sharp, poisonous hook hidden in the bait. I closed my eyes, feeling a cold, heavy wave of absolute disgust wash over my entire body. Jason was not calling to catch up on old times. He was acting as a willing proxy for my mother. She had specifically enlisted him to gather crucial intelligence. She desperately wanted my exact office address so she could show up unannounced and cause a catastrophic scene in front of my superiors. She wanted to know the exact numbers of my new salary so she could sit at her kitchen table and calculate exactly how much money she felt entitled to aggressively demand from me. She was using my childhood friend to stalk me. "Jason," I said, my voice dropping to a low, flat, utterly terrifying register. "Do not ever call this number again. And tell Eleanor she needs to find a new spy." I hung up the phone before he could stammer out a pathetic response and immediately blocked his number. I then opened my laptop, pulled up my Aunt Susan's social media profiles, and did some quick digging. Sure enough, there were several recent, cryptic comments from Jason on her posts about helping family stay connected. It was a coordinated, deeply pathetic effort. The betrayal from a childhood friend stung briefly, but it ultimately only solidified my ironclad resolve. I was completely surrounded by manipulators, liars, and emotional vampires, and I desperately needed to permanently fortify my defenses. 6 incredibly productive months passed in a flash. The heavy silence from Rochester stretched on, but my professional career in Seattle completely skyrocketed. Our consulting firm successfully finalized the massive real estate restructuring deal, saving the corporate client from total bankruptcy and generating a truly massive, unprecedented influx of revenue for our senior partners. Mr. Sterling called me into his spacious, glass-walled office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. He did not offer me a seat. He simply pushed a thick, black leather folder across his polished mahogany desk. "Open it, David. Look inside," Sterling commanded, his eyes gleaming with a rare, genuine respect. I opened the heavy folder. Inside was a brand new, incredibly lucrative contract. He was officially promoting me to the highly coveted position of junior partner. The base compensation package was absolutely staggering, but it was the significant equity share in the firm that truly shocked me. My financial future was completely, permanently secure. "You earned every single page of this contract, David," Sterling said, walking around his desk and leaning against the edge. "You have a brilliant legal mind, but with the prestigious new title comes a terrifying new level of responsibility. We just finalized the aggressive acquisition of a massive portfolio of distressed, toxic debt from a failing regional bank on the East Coast. It is an absolute nightmare of a file. We are talking high-risk consumer loans, defaulted luxury auto leases, abandoned credit lines, and unpaid mortgages. I want you to personally head the department that audits this disaster of a portfolio. I need you to clean it up, ruthlessly liquidate the dead weight, file the necessary lawsuits, and turn a massive profit for this firm." I accepted the monumental challenge immediately, shaking his hand firmly. For the next 4 weeks, I worked incredibly closely with Mr. Vance, the terrifyingly efficient head of our firm's aggressive debt recovery and legal enforcement department. We combed through thousands of pages of financial ruin, hunting for recoverable assets and preparing aggressive legal action. And then, late one Thursday evening, while sitting alone in my office cross-referencing defaulted auto leases in the newly acquired East Coast portfolio, a specific, painfully familiar name flashed on my high-resolution computer monitor. Arthur's name. My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. The air left my lungs. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes rapidly scanning the heavily redacted lines of the digital legal file. It was not a clerical mistake. It was not a coincidence. It was the exact, legally binding lease agreement for the luxury Porsche 911. The very same Porsche I had been unknowingly and unwillingly funding with my blood and sweat for years. When I abruptly cut off the automatic transfers on the night of the graduation dinner, Arthur, completely devoid of any actual income or work ethic, had entirely failed to make the exorbitant monthly payments. The desperate dealership had immediately sold the defaulted lease to a ruthless regional collection agency, which had then bundled it into the massive, toxic portfolio of distressed debt that our Seattle consulting firm had just purchased for pennies on the dollar. My hands began to shake slightly as I pulled up the associated, cross-referenced credit accounts attached to the file. My mother's name, my father's name, there they were. Maxed out premium credit cards, defaulted high-interest personal loans, severely delinquent lines of credit. Without my monthly $2,000 injection of stolen cash, their entire fabricated financial house of cards had completely, spectacularly collapsed in less than 6 months. And by an absolute, incredible, almost poetic stroke of cosmic justice, the elite corporate consulting firm where I was now a powerful junior partner had legally purchased their massive debt. Legally, on paper, my firm owned them. We owned their cars. We owned their credit. We practically owned the roof over their heads. And I was the senior executive in charge of mercilessly liquidating that exact portfolio. I sat back in my ergonomic chair in the quiet, darkened office, listening to the rain hit the glass. A slow, incredibly dangerous, and deeply satisfying realization began to bloom in the center of my chest. I did not just have my personal freedom anymore. I had absolute, unyielding legal power over the very people who had spent my entire life trying to destroy me. The following Monday morning at exactly 9:15, the front desk receptionist called my direct office line. Her voice was incredibly panicked and hushed. "David, I am so incredibly sorry to bother you with this. There are 3 very aggressive people in the main lobby demanding to see you right now. They do not have an appointment." The older woman is screaming at the security guard, making a massive scene, demanding her son's salary and screaming about a stolen college fund. It is causing a huge disruption. I looked at the phone receiver in my hand. A cold, predatory, utterly ruthless smile slowly spread across my face. The trap had not been set by me. They had walked blindly into the steel jaws all on their own. "Do not call the police just yet," I told the terrified receptionist, my voice perfectly calm. "Send them back to conference room B. Do not offer them coffee. I will be right there." I slowly stood up from my heavy oak desk, buttoning the front of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. I walked out of my office and headed down the long, glass-paneled hallway of the executive floor. My leather shoes were completely silent on the thick, expensive corporate carpet. I felt absolutely no fear. I felt no lingering childhood anxiety. I only felt the cold, hard, terrifying certainty of a man who held every single winning card in his hand and was about to lay them all face up on the table. I paused directly outside the heavy frosted glass doors of conference room B, taking one deep, steadying breath to completely eradicate any trace of emotion from my face. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped inside. My mother, my father, and Arthur were standing in the dead center of the massive room. They looked absolutely atrocious. The polished, arrogant, aggressively superior veneer they had so carefully maintained at the Del Monaco restaurant just months prior was completely, utterly gone. My father's supposedly expensive suit looked incredibly cheap, wrinkled, and poorly fitted. My mother's hair was unkempt, the roots showing, and her eyes were darting around the luxurious, intimidating conference room with a chaotic mixture of intense, ravenous greed and desperate, underlying panic. And Arthur, the golden boy, he stood slightly behind our parents, looking pale, terrified, and entirely out of his element. He was aggressively clutching the leather keychain of his precious Porsche in his sweaty hand like it was a physical lifeline keeping him from drowning. "It is about damn time you showed your face," my mother snapped the absolute second I walked into the room, though her voice noticeably lacked its usual, terrifyingly commanding sting. It wavered slightly. "Do you have any earthly idea how incredibly hard it was to find this place? We had to practically beg Jason for the address after you so rudely blocked his number." I walked calmly, deliberately, to the head of the incredibly long, polished oak table. I did not pull out a chair. I did not sit down. I simply rested my hands flat on the cool wood and stared at them in total silence for 10 long seconds, letting the immense power dynamic of the room crush them. "You have exactly 2 minutes to explain precisely why you are aggressively trespassing in my firm's private corporate offices before I have armed security physically escort you out to the street," I said. My voice was completely flat, entirely devoid of anger, sadness, or familial warmth. My father immediately stepped forward, trying desperately to puff his chest out, attempting one last time to play the role of the intimidating, unquestionable patriarch. "Do not you dare take that disrespectful tone with me, David. You are still my son, whether you like it or not," my father barked, though his hands were slightly trembling. "We are here because you made a terrible, impulsive mistake. When you threw your little childish temper tantrum at the restaurant and selfishly cut off the bank accounts, you severely damaged your brother's credit score. The dealership is aggressively threatening to send repo men for Arthur's car. The bank is threatening a massive, ruinous lawsuit over the credit cards you forced us to use. Arthur's tech startup is at a crucial, delicate phase of development." My mother pleaded loudly, stepping forward, though her eyes were hard, calculating, and demanding. "He desperately needs that luxury car for high-level investor meetings. You are making a huge six-figure salary now, David. We see the luxury of this office. We know you got a massive promotion. You need to pull out your checkbook and write a check right now to clear the substantial arrears and immediately reinstate the monthly transfers. You stole his college fund by refusing to help him. Family helps family, David." I stared at them, completely unblinking. The sheer, unadulterated, mind-boggling audacity of their ridiculous demands was almost physically breathtaking. They had driven across the entire country, aggressively tracked down my highly secure workplace using a spy, caused a humiliating public scene in my corporate lobby, and were now aggressively, righteously demanding my hard-earned salary to fund a luxury sports car for a grown, 26-year-old man who absolutely refused to work a single day in his life. "Arthur," I said, completely ignoring my parents' frantic rambling. I locked eyes with my brother. His eyes immediately darted away. "Are you really, truly building a tech startup, Arthur?" Arthur swallowed incredibly hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, looking quickly at our mother for guidance and protection like a frightened toddler. I have very solid ideas, David. I am aggressively networking in the right circles." "You are 26 years old," I said softly, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a surgical scalpel. "You have never held a single job for more than 3 consecutive weeks. You drive a Porsche entirely funded by your older brother's blood, sweat, and starvation. And you use our parents' stolen credit cards to buy incredibly expensive drinks for college kids in Miami. How dare you speak to your brother like that?" My mother screamed at the top of her lungs, violently slamming her hand flat on the oak table. "You will write the damn check right this second, David. You owe us for raising you under our roof. If you do not pay the bank right now, they are going to file a lawsuit and take absolutely everything we have." I did not flinch. I slowly, deliberately reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I pressed one single button on the screen. "Mr. Vance," I said calmly into the speaker, "could you please bring the East Coast distressed debt portfolio files to conference room B immediately? Specifically, I need the 3 thick red folders. Right away, David." Vance's gruff, highly intimidating voice replied through the speaker. My parents exchanged a deeply confused, highly panicked look. "Who the hell is Mr. Vance?" my father demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Are you calling your corporate lawyer? Because we can absolutely call ours. We know people." "You cannot afford a lawyer," I stated simply, stating an absolute, undeniable mathematical fact. A moment later, the heavy glass door swung open. Mr. Vance, a tall, incredibly broad-shouldered man who had spent 20 ruthless years in high-stakes corporate litigation and aggressive, unapologetic debt recovery, walked into the room. He carried 3 incredibly thick, brightly colored red folders. He walked to the table, placed them neatly in a row directly in front of me, gave my terrified family a completely dismissive, disgusted look, and stood silently by the door, crossing his massive arms. I slowly picked up the first heavy red folder. I opened it and meticulously spread the complex legal documents out across the smooth oak table for them to see. "Let me explain something to you, Robert," I said, intentionally using my father's first name, watching him physically flinch at the profound disrespect. You are completely 100% right. The regional bank is indeed threatening a massive lawsuit. The luxury dealership is absolutely preparing to violently repossess the Porsche. The premium credit cards are entirely, hopelessly defaulted. But you are very, very confused about who exactly you owe all this money to. I tapped the thick stack of legal documents on the table with my index finger. 2 weeks ago, this exact consulting firm, the elite firm where I am currently sitting as a highly compensated junior partner, purchased a massive, multi-million-dollar portfolio of distressed, toxic debt from your specific regional bank in Rochester. We bought it in bulk for pennies on the dollar with the explicit, unyielding corporate goal of aggressive, ruthless liquidation. My mother's face instantly turned the sickening color of wet ash. All the blood drained from her head. Arthur took a frantic step backward, physically bumping into the wall behind him. I am the senior executive exclusively in charge of auditing, managing, and liquidating this specific portfolio. I continued, my voice echoing loudly and powerfully in the quiet room. I do not work for your bank. I am not playing the role of your obedient, terrified son right now. I am the sole legal representative of your primary creditor. We legally own the lease to the Porsche. We legally own the maxed-out credit card debt. We legally own the secondary personal loans you fraudulently took out to fund Arthur's pathetic, fabricated lifestyle. That is completely impossible. My father stammered weakly, his hands visibly shaking violently as he leaned over the table to desperately look at the paperwork. He saw his own messy signature. He saw the intimidating corporate letterhead of my firm firmly attached to the legal deed of assignment. The absolute, crushing reality of the horrific situation crashed down on his shoulders like a physical, ton-weight blow. It is entirely possible, and it is entirely 100% legal, I said, feeling an incredible, intoxicating rush of absolute, vindicating power flooding my veins. You came into my building to aggressively demand my salary to pay off a faceless bank. But you are looking directly at the face of the bank. And I am telling you, right here, right now, as your creditor, that I am officially denying your pathetic request for a payment extension. I am officially denying your request for a settlement plan. David, please. My mother suddenly gasped, her arrogant, impenetrable mask completely, violently shattering into a million pieces. Hot tears of genuine, unadulterated terror sprang into her eyes. The master manipulator had just lost absolutely all her leverage in a matter of seconds. You cannot do this to us. We are your parents. We will lose the house. We will be on the street. Arthur will go to jail for the credit card fraud. Arthur committed credit card fraud? I raised a sharp eyebrow, looking over at Vance, feigning surprise. Please make sure to note that down carefully, Mr. Vance. That detail will be incredibly useful for the upcoming lawsuit and the criminal referral. Yes, sir. Duly noted, Vance said, a dark, incredibly satisfied smirk playing heavily on his lips. I gave you absolutely everything I had, I said, leaning aggressively over the table, bringing my face incredibly close to my weeping mother's. I worked 3 grueling jobs. I completely ruined my physical health. I wore cheap shoes with massive holes in them so you could live in a ridiculous fantasy world. And when I finally achieved something monumental, you sat in a public restaurant and coldly told me you wished I was never born. I straightened up, calmly adjusting my expensive cufflinks. Your wish is permanently granted. I am not David the obedient son. I am David the corporate creditor. Mr. Vance, please initiate the immediate, forceful repossession of the luxury vehicle currently parked in our visitor lot, and officially file the massive lawsuit for the completely defaulted balances by end of business today. Offer them absolutely no settlements. Prepare to aggressively garnish their wages. Put a massive lien on their real estate if you have to. Take everything. Arthur let out a pathetic, high-pitched, incredibly embarrassing sob. My father stood completely frozen, utterly, thoroughly broken by his own monumental arrogance. My mother fell heavily into one of the expensive leather chairs, covering her face and wailing loudly, a truly pathetic sound. But her dramatic tears did absolutely nothing to me. The deep well of my empathy was completely, permanently dry. "Get them out of my firm," I commanded Mr. Vance. I turned my back on them completely and walked purposefully toward the door, leaving them to their ruin. I absolutely did not stay in the room to watch them be physically removed by our security team, but Mr. Vance, ever the professional, gave me the full, highly detailed report later that afternoon over a cup of coffee. Armed corporate security had to physically escort my father out by his elbow because his legs seemingly stopped working from the sheer shock. My mother, completely losing her mind, screamed hysterically all the way down the elevator and through the incredibly busy main lobby, aggressively threatening to call the police, completely and utterly humiliating herself in front of dozens of our high-net-worth corporate clients. The absolute sweetest, most satisfying moment of the entire ordeal, however, belonged to Arthur. He had frantically marched out to the visitor parking lot, fully intending to jump into the driver's seat and flee the state in the Porsche, only to find a massive, heavy-duty commercial tow truck already securely hitching the rear axle of the expensive sports car. Vance's recovery team worked incredibly fast. Arthur actually threw a screaming temper tantrum on the hard concrete, screaming profanities at the burly tow truck driver, but it was completely useless. The firm legally held full custody of the physical assets, and the vehicle was aggressively seized right in front of his eyes. My parents and Arthur, completely stranded, were forced to walk to a bus stop in the pouring rain and take a public city bus to the airport, their ridiculous, carefully curated luxury facade entirely, permanently stripped away. In the grueling weeks that immediately followed, the massive, highly efficient legal machinery of our corporate consulting firm relentlessly ground down what little was left of their pathetic pride. Our lawyers moved with terrifying speed. We successfully petitioned the courts and began to aggressively garnish my father's modest retirement accounts to rapidly pay off the mountain of credit card debt they had accumulated. We quickly placed a heavy, inescapable legal lien on their residential real estate in Rochester. They were financially ruined, facing total bankruptcy, entirely by their own hand and their own unyielding greed. But the final, most sickening, absolutely mind-blowing twist of the entire nightmare came exactly a month later. It arrived buried inside a standard, cheap white envelope delivered directly to my private office. It was a letter from Arthur. It was entirely handwritten, the blue ink penmanship messy, frantic, and barely legible. He was absolutely not writing to sincerely apologize for his years of abuse. He was writing to aggressively deflect blame, exactly as he had been meticulously taught to do his entire pathetic life. But in his desperate, cowardly attempt to throw our parents completely under the bus to save his own skin, he accidentally revealed a massive, horrifying secret that finally explained the darkest, most confusing corners of my childhood. "David, you have to tell your lawyers to stop the massive lawsuit," Arthur's frantic letter began. "It absolutely wasn't my idea to take your hard-earned money. Mom and Dad planned the entire thing. 5 years ago, when you started making really good money tutoring those college kids, Dad told Mom that if you saved enough of your salary, you would eventually buy your own real estate or get married, build a massive divorce fund, and leave them completely behind. They explicitly, deliberately told me to get the expensive Porsche lease and completely max out the premium credit cards so they could aggressively guilt you into paying for it all. Mom specifically said if they kept your bank accounts entirely drained and kept you physically exhausted from working, you would never, ever have the energy or the financial independence to leave the family. They intentionally used me to keep you permanently trapped. Punish them, David, not me." I sat frozen at my massive oak desk, staring at the messy blue ink on the incredibly cheap notebook paper. They deliberately, systematically drained me. It wasn't just poor financial management or blind, misguided favoritism toward Arthur. It was a highly calculated, deeply predatory, borderline sociopathic strategy. My own mother and father intentionally conspired to keep me completely impoverished, physically exhausted, and emotionally broken so I would remain their permanent, unquestioning financial slave. They did not want a son. They wanted an indentured servant who would fund their ridiculous lives forever. They actively plotted to steal my future so I could never afford an inheritance for my own children or even afford a basic life. A much younger version of me, the desperate little boy who craved their love and approval above all else, might have broken down and cried hysterically at that horrifying revelation. He might have asked why to an empty, silent room. But that boy officially died at the dinner table at Delmonico. He had his emotional funeral months ago. I felt absolutely nothing reading that letter but a cold, clinical, profound disgust. I did not reply to the letter. I did not call Arthur to angrily verify the horrifying details. I simply stood up from my chair, walked deliberately over to the heavy-duty corporate paper shredder humming quietly in the corner of my office, and fed the letter directly into the sharp metal teeth. I watched the cheap paper be instantly destroyed, shredded into 100 completely unrecognizable pieces. The physical destruction of that written confession was the final, necessary act of my internal cleansing. I realized in that exact moment that keeping their dark secrets, carrying their heavy shame, and endlessly analyzing their toxic motivations was just another subtle way of letting them control my mind. By shredding the confession and refusing to engage, I was formally, permanently resigning from the horrible role they had violently forced upon me. I was no longer the tragic victim of their cruel scheme. I was the powerful architect of their ultimate consequence. The massive lawsuit proceeded without a single ounce of mercy. The family house in Rochester was eventually foreclosed on and sold at a steep loss at auction to cover their massive, mounting debts. I heard through the corporate grapevine, right before I completely and permanently blocked Aunt Susan and the rest of the toxic extended family, that my parents were forced to hastily move into a tiny, cramped, incredibly run-down apartment on the absolute outskirts of town. Arthur, completely stripped of his luxury car, his endless allowance, and his protective shield, was finally forced to get a grueling minimum-wage job stocking heavy shelves at a local Walmart just to survive. The golden child was finally, painfully introduced to the real world, and he found it to be entirely unforgiving. They had desperately tried to bury me alive under the suffocating weight of their expectations and their relentless greed. But they did not realize I was an incredibly resilient seed. And the immense pressure they applied only forced me to grow stronger, violently breaking through the heavy dirt to finally reach the light. The incredible, highly dramatic story of my sudden, unprecedented promotion to junior partner and the ruthless, brilliant, legally flawless way our firm handled the aggressive acquisition of the East Coast distressed debt portfolio began to circulate rapidly in the elite Seattle corporate circles. It quickly caught the intense attention of a major, highly respected national business magazine. They aggressively pursued me, wanting to do a massive feature piece on my career trajectory. The seasoned journalist, a sharp, incredibly perceptive, and highly intelligent woman named Elena, sat directly across from me in my spacious office for the exclusive interview. She asked incredibly detailed questions about my complex financial strategies, my aggressive market analysis, and how I managed to keep my head completely cool and calculating during high-stakes, multi-million-dollar corporate litigation. You have a fierce reputation in this city for being entirely, completely unshakable, David, Elena said, leaning forward, her digital recorder blinking a steady red light on the polished table between us. Most junior partners completely crack under the immense pressure of ruthlessly liquidating hostile assets. They lose sleep. They burn out. Where does that incredible, almost terrifying resilience come from? I turned my head and looked out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. It was a perfectly clear, incredibly beautiful day in Seattle, the deep blue water of the bay sparkling brightly in the distance. I thought deeply about the greasy diner in Rochester where I scrubbed floors. I thought about the freezing, unheated college apartment, the canceled bank transfers, the shredded confession letter, and the sheer, unadulterated look of absolute panic on my mother's face in conference room B. I smiled. It was not an arrogant smile. It was a genuine, quiet, deeply peaceful smile. Resilience is absolutely not something you are magically born with, Elena, I said slowly, choosing my words with absolute, deliberate precision for the recorder. It is something you are violently forced to build brick by brick when the ground underneath you constantly, aggressively shifts. You quickly learn to be entirely unshakable when you finally realize that the only person coming to save you from drowning is you. I survived the absolute hardest, most grueling battles of my entire life long before I ever stepped foot in a fancy corporate boardroom. Complex corporate business is incredibly easy compared to family trauma. Surviving the profound betrayal of the people who were biologically supposed to love and protect you is the real agonizing work. Once you win the fierce custody battle over your own sanity, no corporate lawsuit can ever scare you. When the expansive, highly detailed article finally went live on the magazine's website, the overwhelming public response was absolutely staggering. It went completely, massively viral, reaching far, far beyond the insular corporate finance sector. My professional corporate email inbox was instantly flooded, not just with lucrative client inquiries, but with literally hundreds of deeply emotional messages from total strangers across the entire country. People who had quietly endured severely narcissistic parents, people who had been the designated family scapegoat, people who had been financially and emotionally bled dry by the ones they trusted most in the world. They wrote incredibly long, highly detailed, deeply emotional emails telling me how my specific story gave them the incredible courage to finally check their own exploited bank accounts, to hire a ruthless lawyer, to demand their rightful inheritance, to finally cut the toxic, suffocating cords they had been dragging around for decades. Reading their painful stories felt like standing in a massive, brightly lit room completely surrounded by faces I had never actually met, but whose profound, silent pain I understood on a deep, cellular level. I was absolutely not alone. The quiet, agonizing suffering I had endured for years in Rochester was a universal, tragic language spoken by thousands. One quiet evening, about a full year after the explosive, life-altering confrontation in the corporate conference room, I stepped out onto the expansive private balcony of my incredible new penthouse apartment. The vibrant Seattle skyline pulsed softly and beautifully beneath a cool layer of evening mist. I held a heavy crystal glass of incredibly expensive bourbon, the exact kind my father used to drink to feel important, but I bought this specific bottle with my own money, earned entirely through my own brilliance and grueling hard work. I leaned comfortably against the thick glass railing, letting the cool, damp, incredibly refreshing air settle against my skin. The massive city glimmered brightly below, a beautiful scatter of gold and blue lights perfectly reflecting off the dark, calm water of the bay. The world felt incredibly vast, entirely open, and for the very first time in my entire life, it felt full of genuine, limitless possibility. I thought briefly of the exhausted, deeply desperate young man who spent years trying to earn basic, fundamental affection from cruel people who treated love like a cold financial transaction. That young man was entirely, permanently gone now. He had been laid to rest. In his place stood someone steadier, harder, vastly more intelligent, and undeniably, completely whole. I had meticulously built a massive fortress around my inner peace, and the thick stone walls were entirely impenetrable. I was absolutely not wishing for my parents to call. I was not secretly hoping for a miraculous, tearful apology that would never, ever come. I was not anxiously rehearsing what I would say if they suddenly showed up crying at my secure door. I was simply breathing, steady, completely unhurried, and finally absolutely free from their toxic chains. Maybe I was never the obedient, sacrificial, completely broken son they desperately wanted me to be. But through their horrific cruelty, I became the fiercely independent, entirely unbreakable man I desperately needed to be. And the massive empire I am building now belongs to absolutely no one but me. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. If you have ever carried the unbearable, suffocating weight of a toxic family that only saw your value in exactly what they could extract from you, know this: you are absolutely not crazy, you are entirely not selfish, and you are definitely not alone. You have the absolute, undeniable right to ruthlessly protect your peace, your finances, and your sanity, even if it means walking away permanently from the people who share your blood. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.